Okay, so you want to own a pawn shop. Picture the bell over the door instead of a doorbell, a wall of guitars and gold chains catching the light, a hand-lettered sign in the window that just says cash, and a register that fills up before lunch on a slow Tuesday. It feels like the last honest business left, the one place where a stranger's bad week turns directly into your good one. Now picture the back room. 41 unclaimed leaf blowers. 3 chainsaws nobody ever came back for. A wedding ring you appraised for 11 minutes while the man who pawned it stood outside on his phone and never walked back in. That's the real pawn shop, the one behind the neon sign, and it looks nothing like the fantasy. The U.S. pawn industry moves somewhere between $4.5 and $6 billion a year, and the average loan behind that number is under $180, with a profit on a single transaction that can be smaller than what you'd tip a waiter. So the real question isn't whether pawning grandma's ring is a profitable business. It's who actually ends up owning the wealth that business generates over time, and the answer has almost nothing to do with what's sitting in your display case. A pawn shop is not one business. It's 3, and each one is a different door into the same industry. The first door is the corner shop, the one you're picturing right now. A single storefront, an owner behind the counter, roughly 7,700 of these operating across the U.S. according to the National Pawnbrokers Association, though other industry counts run closer to 11,800 once every unlicensed and part-time operation gets folded in. This is the shop where the owner appraises the guitar personally, argues over $5, and goes home with whatever's left after rent. Plenty of these owners are also quietly sitting on something that has nothing to do with pawn tickets at all, a building bought decades ago for a fraction of what it's worth today, a detail that matters a lot more than it sounds like right now. The second door is the regional chain, a handful to a few dozen locations under one name, professionally run, with a back office doing the pricing instead of gut instinct. The third door is the publicly traded consolidator, a company most people who've never sold a ring have never heard of, running thousands of stores across multiple countries, financed by public markets instead of a home equity loan, and that third door is where an enormous share of the actual money in this industry ends up, which we'll get to later, because that's where a huge amount of the real money hides. You're walking through door 1 here because that's the one you can actually walk into and buy. Here's where it gets interesting, though. The corner shop and the consolidator are doing almost exactly the same transaction, loaning cash against a wedding ring, a guitar, a lawnmower. The difference in outcome between the two isn't the transaction. It's everything built around it, and that's exactly what the next several minutes are going to take apart piece by piece. Here's the actual price of admission, and it stacks up faster than the neon sign suggests. First, the real estate. A pawn shop lives or dies on foot traffic and visibility, and a commercial lease for that kind of storefront runs somewhere between $2,000 and $5,000 a month in a smaller town, climbing past $10,000 a month in a high-traffic urban corridor. Second, the license itself. Pawnbroking isn't a business you back into with a general business license. It requires its own permit, typically somewhere between $1,000 and $5,000 up front, plus renewal fees every single year for as long as the doors stay open. Third, and this is the one most people underestimate, the loan float. Every shop only lends against a fraction of what an item is actually worth, called the loan-to-value ratio, usually somewhere between 25% and 60% of appraised value, built in as a cushion against something going wrong. Before a single customer walks in, that float needs cash sitting in a vault, typically somewhere between $20,000 and $100,000 just to open with a usable inventory of loans. Sounds like a lot. It's not even the hard part yet. Fourth, security. Cameras, reinforced display cases, a proper safe, and a monitoring contract run somewhere between $5,000 and $20,000, and that's before the first break-in. Fifth, the software. Pawn transactions aren't like ringing up a t-shirt. Every loan needs a ticket, a description, and, in most jurisdictions, a direct feed to police databases, and that tracking software runs somewhere between $2,000 and $10,000 to license. Sixth, insurance, because the shop is now the custodian of other people's jewelry, guns, and instruments, and that policy runs somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000 a year. Add it up, and a bare-bones new shop can burn through a couple $100,000 before it's lent out a single dollar. Buying an existing shop instead of building one is its own math entirely. Business brokers who specialize in valuing these operations, like the ones at Stall Cup Group, price a working pawn shop at somewhere between 2.5 and 5 times its adjusted annual profit, meaning a shop clearing $300,000 a year in real profit can trade hands for well over $1 million. Either path, new or existing, this isn't the price of a used car. It's the price of a small apartment building, and the ring in the window hasn't even been appraised yet. Here's the trap, and it's not the rent. A pawnbroker in the U.S. operates under roughly 14 separate federal statutes and regulations, stacked directly on top of whatever state and city licensing already applies, a regulatory load that goes back to 1892, when states first started formally licensing the trade. Every single transaction, the guitar, the ring, the leaf blower, has to be logged with a description and an ID and reported, usually daily, into a shared database that local police departments use to hunt for stolen property, often through a system called Leads Online. That's not optional paperwork done at the owner's convenience. In most cities, it's a same-day legal requirement, and missing it isn't a fine, it's a threat to the license itself. Now, here's where it gets dangerous. The interest rate a shop is even allowed to charge on a loan is set state by state, sometimes city by city, and the range is almost unbelievable. In Massachusetts, banking regulators cap most approved rates around 36% annually, though a handful of cities have negotiated theirs down to as low as 12%. Cross state lines and the ceiling can run past 200% annualized. Read that again. Two shops doing the identical transaction, a $60 loan against a guitar, can be legally required to earn wildly different returns on it depending entirely on which side of a state border they're standing on. Then there's the staff, running somewhere between 25 and 30% of gross revenue just in payroll, because unlike a vending machine, someone has to appraise a diamond ring correctly at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning without either lowballing a regular customer or eating a $400 loss on a fake. Add an industry benchmark of 8 to 10% of loans simply never getting repaid, plus theft and inventory shrinkage that brokers expect to stay under 2 to 3% of stock, and the business runs on raw materials that are volatile, customers who are occasionally desperate, and a single compliance failure that can be existential. Australia's cash converters chain found that out directly. The Australian Securities and Investments Commission ordered it in November of 2016 to refund $10.8 million to roughly 118,000 customers and pay a further $1.35 million penalty, after it turned out the company hadn't been properly checking whether borrowers could actually afford the loans it was writing. That one finding, repeated across further lawsuits, eventually cost the company tens of millions more. Now, here's the part nobody tells you, and it comes in layers, obvious money on top, stranger money underneath. The first and most visible layer is the loan itself, the interest and fees charged while an item sits in the back waiting to be redeemed, meaning bought back by the original owner within the loan term. At EzCorp, one of the larger publicly traded pawn operators, this single layer accounted for 63% of total company revenue in its own financial disclosures, and because the cost of lending out cash you already have sitting in a vault is close to zero, the gross margin on that interest runs somewhere between 85 and 95%. That's a margin most retailers would consider fictional. Second layer, what happens when the item isn't redeemed, called forfeiture, and becomes shop property to resell? Nationally, roughly 85% of pawn customers do come back and redeem their item, according to the National Pawnbrokers Association, which means the 15% who don't hand the shop free inventory, it can resell at retail. That resale layer made up another 34% of S-Corp's revenue. At a gross margin, the company reported around 38%, lower than the loan interest but still healthy for second-hand retail. Third layer, and this is where gold comes in. When a shop buys jewelry outright instead of lending against it, called a buy-sell transaction, it typically pays somewhere between 30 and 60% of the item's melt value, meaning the raw scrap value of the metal by weight, with most offers clustering around 40 to 50%. Which of those first three layers do you think ever shows up in the shop's advertising? None of them. All anyone advertises is the price of gold. Fourth layer, smaller but consistent, layaway, where a customer pays down retail merchandise in installments before taking it home, which captures margin on resale inventory without ever taking on loan risk at all. Stack all four layers on a single well-run shop, and the result is net profit margins that industry brokers say average somewhere between 8 and 25%, with the best-run operations clearing 28 to 40%, genuinely competitive with almost any small business in the country. So far, a pawn shop sounds like a quiet, boring machine that mints cash out of other people's bad weeks, and on paper, for the person behind the counter, it mostly does. But here's the part that doesn't add up yet. If the math is this good at the level of one shop, why does the real fortune in this industry belong almost entirely to people who have never appraised a single ring in their life? A savings account pays more than almost anything else a bank will sell you, and a pawn loan can out-earn a savings account many times over, which is the first clue that the shop itself is the bait. The neighborhood pawnbroker, the neon sign, the guy who knows your name because you've hawked the same guitar 3 times, that's the version of this business built for a documentary about the American underdog. The real money room sits one level down, and it's this. A pawn loan is functionally a high-yield lending product wearing a retail storefront as a disguise, operating with a lighter regulatory touch than almost any bank would tolerate. No credit check, no collection calls, no damage to a credit score if the loan is never repaid, because it's what's called a non-recourse loan, meaning the lender's only remedy for default is keeping the collateral, nothing more. Strip away the guitars and the gold, and what's left is a lender charging annualized rates that, depending on the state, can run into the hundreds of percent on assets it has already discounted heavily on the way in. That's the real money room. But it isn't the deepest layer, and this is where a huge amount of the actual wealth in this industry hides. Somewhere in Fort Worth, Texas, sits a company called First Cash, formed in 2016 when 2 competing pawn operators, one built by an oil man turned pawnbroker named Jack Dougherty, the other by a Texas pawn shop owner named John Payne, merged into a single publicly traded company. By the end of 2024, First Cash was running just over 3,000 pawn stores across the U.S. and Latin America, pulling in $3.38 billion in total revenue, $737 million of that from loan fees alone. Remember loan-to-value from the entry costs, how much a shop is willing to lend against an item's worth? At the scale of 3,000 stores, that pricing gets tuned with data no single shopkeeper will ever have access to, across states with wildly different rate caps, functionally arbitraging the gap between a 36% state and a 200% one. And the company doesn't just lend and resell. It pays a quarterly cash dividend and buys back its own stock, funded by cash flow squeezed out of thousands of small transactions that each look, individually, exactly like the $60 guitar loan from the corner shop. The wedding ring in the display case was never the product. The interest rate arbitrage across a few thousand identical display cases was. To understand exactly how fast this business can turn on you, look at Pawn America. Brad Rixman opened the first location in 1991 in Robbinsdale, Minnesota, a single storefront with none of the scale that makes the first cash math work. It grew the old-fashioned way, about 100 employees by 2008, 350 by 2011, eventually operating around 24 stores stretched across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and both Dakotas, employing roughly 500 people at its peak. For a regional chain built one storefront at a time, that's a real business, the kind that gets written up in the local paper as a hometown success story. Then the trap nobody warns you about closed in from an unexpected direction. It wasn't a robbery, and it wasn't a bad quarter on gold prices. It was the internet. Big box retailers and online marketplaces started eating into the resale side of the business, the same pressure that was simultaneously hollowing out chains like Sears and J.C. Penney, and Pawn America's traditional storefronts couldn't out-discount a website with no rent to pay. 2 months before the end, the company quietly closed a suburban St. Paul location and cut 50 jobs. Then, in April of 2017, Pawn America filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, listing debts somewhere between $10 million and $50 million owed to hundreds of creditors. Rixman was careful with the language at the time, calling it a reorganization, not a liquidation, and he was right. Pawn America didn't die. It emerged from bankruptcy in May of 2018, but only after cutting its store count from 24 down to 18, abandoning the Dakotas entirely and redirecting staff and investment toward e-commerce, the very thing that had nearly killed it. A company that spent 26 years building physical storefronts survived by admitting the storefronts were no longer the asset that mattered. Pawn America peaked at roughly 24 locations built on foot traffic and a handshake. It survived only by shrinking to 18 and becoming, in part, a website. The lesson isn't that pawn shops fail. It's that scale without leverage over your own cost structure is not the same thing as strength. So here's the actual answer to the question this whole hour has been circling. Pawnbroking itself, the appraising, the lending, the arguing over $5, is genuinely one of the better margin small businesses in the country, and almost nobody who does it well gets remotely rich from it. The wealth collects one level up in 3 specific advantages that scale gives you, and a single storefront never will. The first is real estate. Remember that building many independent owners are quietly sitting on, bought decades ago for a fraction of today's price? For an owner who bought their storefront outright in the 1980s or 90s, that unremarkable brick building in a decent part of town has often appreciated into an asset worth more than every pawn loan the shop has ever written combined, and it sits there compounding whether the shop makes a good loan or a bad one. The second advantage is regulatory arbitrage at scale. A company like First Cash can price loans differently across a dozen states with a dozen different rate caps, routing growth toward wherever the legal ceiling is highest, something a single shop bound to one city council's rate schedule can never do. The third is simply access to capital markets. An independent owner funds growth out of last year's profit or a personal loan. A public consolidator funds it by issuing shares and taking on debt at institutional interest rates far below the 30, 60, or 200% it's charging its own customers, then returns the spread to shareholders through dividends and buybacks. None of that requires being better at appraising a diamond. It requires already owning enough stores, enough buildings, and enough access to cheap capital that the appraising barely matters anymore. That's not a flaw in the business. It's an entirely rational outcome of how the business is structured, and it's exactly why the owner behind the counter and the owner of the company almost never turn out to be the same person. Picture a single, decently located shop, the kind you could actually open. Based on the Scale Economics Larger Chains report, a shop like this might do somewhere around $700,000 in combined loan and retail revenue in a normal year. Now play out two versions of that year. Rough year. Gold prices are flat, redemption rates slip because the local economy is soft, and more customers can't come back for their collateral, pushing the shop's forfeiture rate up past the industry's 10% danger line. More inventory sits on shelves longer. Payroll still eats close to 30% of revenue because appraising doesn't get cheaper just because business is slow, and by December the shop nets somewhere in the neighborhood of $50,000 to $60,000. Rough year. Now the other version. Great year. Gold prices spike, pulling in a wave of walk-in sellers at wide buy-sell margins. Redemption holds steady near that 85% national average. Payroll stays flat because the same 3 employees are just busier, and margins expand toward the 25 to 30% range the best-run shops report. That same location nets closer to $200,000. Great year. Same building, same 3 employees, same neon sign in the window. So where did the extra $150,000 come from? Almost none of it came from working harder. It came from gold prices, local unemployment, and how many strangers happened to walk back through the door to reclaim what they'd pawned. Picture that bell over the door one more time, the wall of guitars catching the afternoon light, the hand-lettered cash sign, the register filling up by lunch. It's still a real business, still capable of paying someone's mortgage. But the wedding ring in the case, the guitar, the gold chain, none of it was ever really the product. The product was always the rate on the loan and, eventually, the real estate underneath the whole operation, and the person who understood that first is very rarely the person standing behind the counter. If you want to see how the same math plays out inside a very different kind of storefront, that video is on your screen now.